To me, the 80s were an exciting time for comics. I had the unique experience of maturing alongside the medium as it expanded in many directions. At least, that's how it felt. I'm sure everyone, regardless of time period, feels that way about their introduction to comics. It seems to me, someone's entry point and their tastes tend to give specific eras more weight than others. So I'm not saying the 80s were the best time ever, and if you disagree, it's because you're obviously inferior and have poopy tastes. I'm just saying it was my time of discovery. And, due to this, it maintains a high degree of nostalgia. Now, this is not a definitive or comprehensive list of the best material from the 80s. It's material I would characterize as sentimental favorites, for one reason or another. As a bit of a disclaimer, usually I sit down and read everything first to make sure I have all the details correct. In this case, I've not done that. I flipped through a bunch of issues and refreshed my memory, but I didn't go deep into detail. So these are my general impressions and memories, not an in-depth review. This has to be mentioned because there may be, let's call them problematic elements, that I've completely overlooked or forgotten. After all, it was the 80s, and there were some things that were culturally acceptable then that aren't nowadays. Got it? Good. Let's move forward. A title that should be on everyone's best of list is Love and Rockets, regardless of whether it's an 80s related list or not. Its influence is hard to chart, but it's safe to say it had a major impact on independent titles, both in the past and in the present. It's a series that ran for 50 issues between 1982 and 1996, although it has been revived in modern times. And it was entirely done by the brothers Jaime and Gilbert Hernandez, with some help from a third brother, Mario. Possibly due to its quarterly publishing schedule, it never achieved the historic notoriety that it should have. Had it been monthly or even bi-monthly, and had it been the size of a regular comic book rather than magazine-sized, it probably would have been more popular than it was. It was always well-reviewed and highly regarded, but it's a title that never reached widespread mainstream appeal. This is a title that's hard to define. That's due to two factors. It straddles the line between underground comics and mainstream comics, and it's not just one genre, it's all the genres simultaneously. It contains everything from abstract experimentalism to science fiction, romance, and the devastating reality of life. Most of all, it's about character. Certainly, there's a distinct Latino flavor to the major storylines, such as Hopper's and Palomar, but like all good fiction, it speaks to the human experience. It may be embedded in a certain culture, but the narrative and themes are universal. At times, it's wildly imaginative, with scenarios that are both realistic and highly fantastical. And each major storyline really fleshes out its own world. One gets embedded in the reality being revealed. Personally, I've always gravitated towards Jaime's work over Gilbert's. That's probably due to the adult Archie comic style that infuses the material. Although, if I'm in the mood for something slow building and a touch surreal, then I'm all over Gilbert's work. So, if you're in the mood to expand your reading tastes, Love and Rockets is a good place to start. Nowadays, it's broken down into collections of various storylines, which is very convenient. I'd suggest flipping through a few and seeing if one connects. Grimjack is about John Gaunt, a principled mercenary living in the extra-dimensional city of Sinishur. Grimjack is a hardened, kick-ass type of person. He's seen some not great stuff, and all that trauma is on his face at all times. Sinishur is the nexus of all realities. It is a patchwork city, cobbled together from many different dimensions, with many different species living there. The very unique conceptual aspect about Sinishur is that the laws of physics change depending on which area one is visiting, as do the rules. Basically, it's the living embodiment of corruption and cultural absolutism. It's populated with street thugs who've banded together into various factions. Conflict is guaranteed. As a setting, it's not only its own character, but it's a place with almost limitless possibilities for stories, which is one of the reasons the series ran for 81 issues. Also, it's hard to overlook the gritty, note-perfect artwork of Timothy Truman. He makes this otherworldly dystopia feel real, which is simply amazing and cannot be overstated. The characters and setting come alive and feel distinctly unique. He would only draw the first 19 issues, but that was more than enough to provide a template for other artists to follow. Even now, some 30 or so years later, the tone and atmosphere of Grimjack still feels extraordinary. Like the city of Sinisher, this comic book has a timeless quality. If reading Grimjack makes you hunger for more Timothy Truman, there's also Scout. It's like a post-apocalyptic spiritual quest, with a lot of violence and a critique of American industrialism. It's probably a little dated and preachy, but it's worth a look if Truman's work appeals to you. An additional related suggestion would be Suicide Squad. The writer of Grimjack, John Ostrander, reworked this old concept into something quite unique. In a nutshell, all the elements used in the movies come directly from this series. More to the point, very few characters felt like they were wearing plot armor, so dangerous missions usually had consequences. Not to mention, using villains against their will to do politically sensitive missions is a morally questionable tactic, like highly questionable. The series doesn't get too deep into that aspect, but it's definitely subtext. The premise of Concrete is going to make it sound more unusual than it is. A speechwriter, Ron Lithgow, is abducted by aliens and has his brain implanted into a gray stone body. He's then returned to society, where he lives his life as this new alien being with superhuman strength, endurance, and other enhancements. This sudden alteration and the loss of some human senses gives him a finer perspective on life and how all the things we take for granted have a certain beauty that can only be appreciated once they've been removed. In other words, through this inhuman-looking being, the writer/artist Paul Chadwick reveals what it's like to be human. Furthermore, Concrete is an immensely likable and relatable character, one who doesn't mope or resent the change forced upon him. He adapts and finds a way to live his life, establishing a new normal. His positive outlook is infectious and genuine. It's not overdone with life-affirming buzzwords, simplistic sentimentality, or toxic positivity. I have to admit, this was a series that was easy to resist. I saw a huge, hulking monster on the cover, flipped through the comic, and then saw him doing nothing but mundane things. It didn't have an immediate appeal, other than Chadwick's artwork. But, once given a chance, I discovered a rather unique book that was refreshing and uplifting, rather than tedious and trite. I don't even know where to start with this epic tale. Like Watchmen, there is a prevalent baked-in fear of nuclear destruction, and its publication was a touchstone breakthrough moment, where manga and anime began to expand into North America. There are many good examples of manga or anime out there, but very few had the influence and impact that Akira did. There are plenty of other people who've discussed this piece of work and have examined it in more depth than I can manage. All I can say is, yeah, it really is that good, and it's basically timeless. In 50 years' time, this will still stand up as an important piece of work. Funny animals or anthropomorphic characters are usually not my thing. That's probably why the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles never really made an impression on me. But there are titles like Howard the Duck and Cerebus that transcend their animal-related protagonists. Usagi Jimbo is one such character. The aspect that is striking about this still ongoing series is it's very violent, but also very wholesome in some respects. It's an odd mixture. By that I mean, there are a lot of fights and a lot of killing, but it's restrained. It's not splatterpunk, in other words. It's also one of the first, if not the first comic that straddles the line between manga and traditional North American comics. That is, it looks like a comic produced by a Western artist, one that emulated the tone and pacing of manga storytelling, but who is artistically influenced by Disney cartoons. I can't speak to the historical accuracy of the setting, but it feels genuine. The main character, Usagi, is an honorable ronin who wanders the country helping those in need. Some storylines are short and others are quite lengthy, but they are expertly paced and feel exactly as long as they need to be. Honestly, I don't have much more to say other than it's a very solid read, and it's still ongoing, which speaks to the strength of the character and Stan Sakai's dedication to the series. Along with Grendel, the first volume of Mage was simply amazing. Both are probably the best titles put out by Kamiko in its brief lifespan. The Elementals might be on that list too. Anyway, the ensuing Mage volumes are less satisfying because, in my opinion, the inherent allegorical biography element takes over the story and diminishes it. However, with the first volume, there is a perfect balance. That's for a few reasons. The biography is represented visually and it's mostly subtext. That is, by the time you get to the end, you've seen the writer/artist, Matt Wagner, literally develop before your eyes, much like the protagonist, Kevin Matchstick, does in the story. This is definitely a lightning in a bottle type of situation. It could not be repeated, regardless of Wagner's best efforts. Mage is also very focused on modernizing Arthurian legend and mythology, which is another strength. The tight focus on one type of mythology keeps it on point. While Grendel may be my favorite, Mage has an alchemical combination of elements that makes it unforgettable. Naturally, Grendel has to be mentioned. It was a series that regularly transformed itself and evolved well beyond its anti-hero roots. I've already covered this in depth in a previous 40-minute video, so you may want to give that a watch. Nexus by Mike Baron and Steve Rude is a very solid combination of writing and art. The series is about Horatio Hellpop, a man who receives superpowers from an alien entity. In exchange, Nexus is compelled to hunt and destroy the worst, most powerful criminals in the galaxy. These are usually fascist rulers who have used inhumane methods to gain power, which sounds like a pretty reasonable mission statement. But there's always moral gray areas to the people Horatio is assigned to kill. In other words, the bad guys are bad, but for some, their motives were sometimes pure. They did what they did for the greater good, one might say. So the issue Nexus struggles with is, the bad guys may have done some questionable deeds, but do they really need to be executed? Unfortunately, once a target is chosen, Nexus has no choice but to follow through, regardless of any moral objections. Otherwise, he'll suffer debilitating agony, terrible nightmares, and potentially die. Nexus also allows his home base to be used as an asylum for refugees, and a whole society builds up around him, some of which have a very cult-like devotion to this reluctant assassin. While this all sounds like very adult, challenging material, it's handled quite well and never gets out of hand with violence, nor does it preach to the reader and act like a handbook to morality. On a related note, this title was also written by Mike Baron. Nowadays, the Badger might not go over too well because the main character is clinically insane, and his, let's call it, distorted view of reality is often the source of humor. But oddly, it's also his greatest strength. ? Overall, it's quite a ridiculous series, Larry. The Flaming Carrot by Bob Burden is guaranteed to be the most absurd superhero title you'll ever read. It is sublime nonsense, and that's said with a fair amount of respect. There's nothing quite like The Flaming Carrot. It contains very little in the form of segues or context, and the entire reading experience is more surreal than a pile of Doom Patrol comics. The original series, by Ben Edlund, is a madcap, mostly humorous look at superheroes. The lead character is just stupidly charming and likable. It's filled with so much potential that it's no surprise it had an animated series and 2 attempts at a live-action TV show. Unfortunately, being a TV writer and producer lured the creator away, and the series was abandoned in 1994, the same year the animated series debuted. Regardless, the 12 issues that do exist are some good superhero fun. The first issue is a great parody of Superman, then it gently parodies Frank Miller's Daredevil work before evolving into its own thing. Reed Fleming, the world's toughest milkman, is a one-note type of character, but it's a consistently funny note. That is, if you find an obnoxious, rude, and perpetually drunk milkman kind of amusing. Nowadays, Reed Fleming would be seen as just a middle-aged bully. But his misadventures are so ridiculous that it's hard to be offended by his consistently bad, over-the-top, alpha male behavior. Neat Stuff by Peter Bagge is reasonably nihilistic and satirical. Like Love and Rockets, it's an anthology series that exists somewhere between old-school underground comics and alternative comics. Eventually, Bagge would settle on the recurring character, Buddy Bradley, and spin him off into his own series, Hate. Sure, Bagge let his characters rant and rave a bit too long at times, and many situations devolved into anger before finding a resolution. But it's a series that appeals to anyone with a misanthropic streak. Cerebus may be the most infamous, controversial comic book series of all time, and for good reason, which I've discussed ad nauseum at this point. The decade started with high society, which flowed into church and state, before ending on the tightly focused Jaka story. It was a series that consistently raised the bar for graphic storytelling. Unfortunately, during the next decade, the series imploded due to the opinions of the creator, Dave Sim. Whatever achievement might have been assigned to the series is now tainted with disclaimers and acknowledgments of what the series became rather than what it once was. Regardless, before this demarcation point, Cerebus was a monster of independent publishing. American Flag is a reasonably good satire in the same vein as the movie Network. Corporations control everything, television is a wasteland, violence is everywhere, and cities have become malls. It's bleak and sarcastic, which characterizes most of Howard Chaykin's work. Honestly, almost everything Frank Miller did in the 80s stands the test of time. There's the obvious choices: Daredevil, The Dark Knight Returns, and Batman Year One. Many would include Ronin on that short list. For me, I thought Ronin started strong and then meandered for too long. So it was a good experiment for the time, but it's not a piece of work that connected with me. The piece of work that does stand out is Elektra Assassin. A good portion of that reason is due to Bill Sienkiewicz's outstanding artwork. Apparently, after each script was illustrated, Miller would look over the artwork and then rewrite the script to suit what Sienkiewicz had painted. That's what gives Elektra Assassin a unique chemical mixture. It was refined so the text and the illustrations worked together seamlessly and complemented one another. The result is almost filled with manic joy. It reads like Miller really enjoyed writing the character while exploring a wild assassination plot with an artist that added more insane energy than he could ever imagine. It was a true collaboration by two creators that were at their peak and in tune with one another. Sandman, by Neil Gaiman and various artists, accomplished one very specific thing. It became an example of comic books as literature. Certainly, many other writers approached the medium seriously, but Gaiman managed to elevate the medium with subtle characterizations, a broad historical context, and complex situations that were resolved in a very adult manner. I've often summarized this series as a depressed god coming to the conclusion that existence has become tiresome. They've made numerous mistakes, committed some unforgivable sins, and the possibility of living with these flaws for eternity is too overwhelming. So, this god engineers their own death. Admittedly, that's a pretty basic summary, but effective nonetheless. And whether or not Morpheus engineered his fate is debatable, but he certainly didn't take steps to prevent it. There's so much foreshadowing and metaphor that a complex structure emerges as the series progresses. It also works as a great allusion to the role and responsibilities of a storyteller, which isn't exclusive to those that fabricate tales for entertainment, but for those that construct a narrative to their own lives. Denny O'Neil wrote the hell out of this 36-issue series. In some ways, it can be seen as a spiritual successor to the classic Green Lantern, Green Arrow series he did with Neil Adams. Except this time, there's a minimal amount of preaching and a lot of moral ambiguity. O'Neil took Steve Ditko's character and basically tossed out everything. In terms of a character transformation, the Question becomes completely unrecognizable from his origin. This is a series that's best described as street-level and gritty. A transformed, renewed Question hits the grimy corners of Hub City and mainly deals with the political corruption that keeps the city in a state of constant anarchy. There's no doubt the Question is a vigilante on a quest to find answers and obtaining very little resolution. Over time, the Question becomes corrupt, which, in my opinion, is a very subtle, possibly unintentional metaphor about social concerns, and he's tempted to kill as a solution to specific challenges. Right and wrong actions become very gray areas. He struggles to abide by his training and morals and remain a good Question. This is in stark contrast to his prior adventures, where everything was black or white, and his goals or ultimate purpose was never in doubt. Again, sometimes the series isn't subtle about the issues it explores, but the development of the Question, how the character evolves and changes due to the influence of the city, is perfectly paced and well done. Alright, that's a list of 20 memorable comics that came from the 80s. An even 20 seems like a good place to pause and wrap things up, or I'll just keep going and this video will never get completed. Sure, it's a list of mainly independent titles, but that wasn't intentional. It just turns out that the comics that have stuck with me during those formative years weren't mainstream. Which isn't a subtle critique of Marvel or DC, both of which published memorable works such as Justice League, Crisis, Martial Law, Walt Simonson's Thor run, Morrison's work on Animal Man and Doom Patrol, Craven's Last Hunt, Alien Legion, The Nom, and Swamp Thing, all of which are honorable mentions. Many I've already examined in other videos, and I didn't want to repeat myself too much. With that said, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, comment, and all that good stuff. And of course, thank you for watching. Additional thanks to all those that directly support this channel and help keep the lights on. I appreciate every single one of you. Thank you, and take care.